A black man returns to his hometown to reclaim his family's historic land, only to face relentless racism and corruption. A powerful white developer and a corrupt police officer conspire to intimidate him with fabricated charges, threats, and systemic bias. As he uncovers shocking truths about the town's deep-seated prejudice, the story exposes blatant racial discrimination and abuse of power. With a community divided between silence and support, his fight becomes a gripping battle against systemic injustice, leaving the audience outraged by the raw, unapologetic portrayal of racism and power dynamics. The rhythmic hum of a single-engine plane faded into the background as Dr. Elijah Carter stepped off the tarmac onto the worn gravel road that led into the heart of Millwood, a town seemingly caught in a perpetual sepia-toned snapshot of the 1950s. Dressed in a charcoal gray suit that seemed out of place against the backdrop of aging brick buildings and faded signs, Elijah exuded an effortless authority, but his presence in Millwood was anything but ceremonial. Though one of the most accomplished neurosurgeons in the country, known for pioneering minimally invasive brain surgery techniques, Elijah had always carried himself with humility. He lived modestly in an understated home in Atlanta and drove a car more notable for its reliability than its luxury. His success had never been about accolades or wealth. It was about lives saved and the legacy of resilience instilled by his parents, who had built a life from nothing after migrating from the rural South. Today, however, he wasn't stepping into an operating room or delivering a keynote at a medical conference. Instead, he was here for a personal errand, one tied to the small parcel of land his grandfather had left behind. It was a matter of principle, preserving a piece of family history in a town that seemed indifferent to its significance. As Elijah walked toward the courthouse, he noticed the subtle but unmistakable shift in the air. Conversations in the diner across the street dwindled to murmurs. Eyes peered from behind curtains in the general store. An older man on the courthouse steps adjusted his hat but didn't return Elijah's polite nod. Millwood might have prided itself on its small-town charm, but to Elijah, the charm felt brittle, like porcelain that could crack under the weight of scrutiny. Inside the courthouse, the faint scent of old varnish and dusty paper filled the air. The building's modesty was clear. Scuffed floors, walls lined with faded portraits of long-gone judges, and a lone ceiling fan that did little to combat the oppressive warmth. Elijah approached the reception desk, where a middle-aged woman with a tightly wound bun and a nameplate reading Deborah sat typing at a computer. She didn't glance up. "Good morning," Elijah said, his voice warm yet firm. "I have an appointment with Judge Whitaker at 11. Deborah's fingers paused mid-typing, but her gaze remained fixed on the screen. "Name?" she asked in a tone that hovered somewhere between indifferent and dismissive. "Dr. Elijah Carter," he replied, watching as her expression flickered, just briefly, with something that could have been recognition or skepticism. Her eyes darted up, scanning his tailored suit, polished shoes, and the leather briefcase he carried. After a pause, she reached for the phone. "One moment," she said curtly, punching in a number and speaking in hushed tones that Elijah couldn't quite catch. As he waited, Elijah's gaze wandered around the room. On the far wall hung a bulletin board crowded with announcements, church bake sales, missing pets, and faded help-wanted ads. Beneath it, a wooden bench sat unoccupied, save for a young mother trying to quiet a restless toddler. The room's stillness felt heavier than it should have, each small movement magnified by the quiet. "Judge Whitaker will see you shortly," Deborah said finally, though her tone offered no warmth. "Have a seat." Elijah gave a polite nod and walked over to the bench. He sat with a measured ease, placing his briefcase on the floor. He knew this dance all too well. The subtle double takes, the deliberate avoidance of eye contact, the careful choreography of small-town hierarchy. He had faced it as a boy growing up in the South, as a young black medical student navigating predominantly white institutions, and even now, as a man whose achievements should have insulated him but didn't. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through emails, the habit of a man accustomed to filling idle moments with productivity. But before he could lose himself in the latest patient consultation notes, the courthouse door creaked open, drawing his attention. A man in his late 50s strode in, his boots clacking against the floor. He was stocky, with a sun-weathered face and a confident gait that suggested he was used to being heard. The man stopped abruptly when he saw Elijah, his eyes narrowing in a way that was hard to mistake. "Morning," the man said, tipping his hat toward Deborah, though his eyes remained fixed on Elijah. "You got business here?" Elijah met his gaze evenly. "I do," he said simply, his tone steady. The man's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't press further. Instead, he turned to Deborah. "Let Judge Whitaker know I'm here too. Tell him Marvin Sims has some thoughts on that property case." Deborah nodded, her expression neutral, as she picked up the phone again. Marvin, as Elijah guessed, was no stranger to the courthouse, and his presence here wasn't a coincidence. The timing, the tone, the air of unspoken challenge. It all fit too neatly. Elijah's grandfather's land was small, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know its history. But to Elijah, it was sacred ground, a testament to his family's perseverance through decades of adversity. To men like Marvin, however, it was an opportunity. "You're here about that Carter land, aren't you?" Marvin asked, his voice tinged with a forced casualness that didn't mask the tension beneath. Elijah gave a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here to ensure the right thing is done." Marvin let out a low chuckle. "Well, I reckon that depends on who you ask." Before Elijah could respond, the door to the judge's chambers opened and a balding man in robes appeared, his expression inscrutable. "Dr. Carter, Mr. Sims, come on back," he said, gesturing for them to follow. Elijah rose smoothly, picking up his briefcase as he walked past Marvin. He felt the man's eyes on him, heavy with unspoken intent, but he didn't falter. This wasn't his first fight, and it wouldn't be his last. The judge's chambers were cramped, lined with law books and cluttered with papers. Judge Whitaker motioned for them to sit, his demeanor professional but distant. As the three men settled in, Elijah felt the weight of what lay ahead. This wasn't just about a plot of land. It was about respect, legacy, and the quiet, persistent fight against a world that too often tried to strip those things away. "Let's get started," Judge Whitaker said, flipping open a file. His tone was clipped, his manner efficient, but Elijah could sense the undercurrents of tension already pulling at the edges of the room. As Marvin leaned forward, ready to stake his claim, Elijah steeled himself. Whatever was coming, he was ready. Judge Whitaker adjusted his glasses, the weight of his authority palpable in the room. He flipped through the file, his brow furrowing slightly as he scanned the documents. Marvin Sims leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his posture dripping with confidence. Elijah remained composed, his hands resting lightly on his briefcase, though his jaw tightened as he waited for the judge to speak. "So," Judge Whitaker began, clearing his throat, "we're here to discuss the ownership and intended use of the Carter property." He looked up, his gaze darting between the two men. "Mr. Sims, you've expressed interest in acquiring this land, is that correct?" Marvin gave a curt nod. "That's right, Your Honor. That plot's been sitting untouched for years. It'd make a fine addition to the development I'm planning on the adjacent land. Good for the town, good for everyone." The judge shifted his focus to Elijah. "Dr. Carter, I understand you filed an objection to this claim?" Elijah straightened, his voice calm but firm. "That's correct, Your Honor. The land in question has been in my family for generations. It holds significant historical and personal value. I've made arrangements to preserve and maintain it as a landmark, honoring its legacy and ensuring it remains part of our community's heritage." Marvin's lips twitched into a smirk. "Heritage is fine and all, but sentiment doesn't pay taxes. That land's been an eyesore for years. My proposal will put it to good use, boost property values, create jobs. Seems to me that's more valuable than a patch of overgrown grass and weeds." Elijah's gaze flicked to Marvin, his calm demeanor betraying none of the irritation brewing inside him. "The land is far from neglected," he said evenly. "My family has invested in its upkeep, and I have plans to enhance its use while preserving its historical importance. This is about more than economics. It's about honoring the sacrifices and resilience of those who came before us." Marvin snorted, the sound dismissive. "Sounds nice on paper, but let's be real. Nostalgia doesn't pay bills." Judge Whitaker held up a hand to silence further comments. "Gentlemen, let's keep this civil." He glanced down at the file again, his fingers drumming the desk. Dr. Carter, you mentioned historical value. Do you have documentation to support this claim? Elijah opened his briefcase and pulled out a neatly bound folder. Yes, Your Honor. This includes records of the land's significance, correspondence from local historians, and architectural assessments of the site's features. Additionally, I've secured funding to establish a small museum on the property to educate the community about its importance. He slid the folder across the desk. Judge Whitaker took it, his expression unreadable as he began flipping through the pages. Marvin, meanwhile, leaned forward, his smirk replaced by a faint scowl. Museum, huh? Marvin said, his tone tinged with skepticism. Sounds like a vanity project to me, Bet, that's funded by out-of-town donors who couldn't care less about Millwood. The funding comes from both local and national sources, Elijah replied, keeping his tone measured. This isn't about vanity, it's about preserving history and creating something meaningful for future generations. Before Marvin could retort, the judge's phone buzzed. Deborah's voice filtered through the intercom. Your Honor, the clerk needs you to review some documents in the main office. Judge Whitaker sighed, pressing a button on the device. I'll be there shortly. He turned back to the men, his tone brisk. I'll review this further and reconvene tomorrow. In the meantime, I expect both parties to refrain from engaging in unproductive arguments. Understood? Understood, Your Honor, Elijah said. Marvin nodded, though his expression suggested otherwise. As the judge left the room, the air grew heavier. Marvin turned to Elijah, his polite facade slipping. Look, Doc, you're new around here, so let me give you a little advice. Folks in Millwood don't take kindly to outsiders swooping in and trying to tell us what's good for our town. Elijah met his gaze without flinching. I appreciate your advice, Mr. Sims, but my family has roots here that run deeper than most. This land isn't just mine, it's part of our collective history. Marvin's eyes narrowed. History don't pay the bills, Carter. You'd do well to remember that. Before Elijah could respond, Deborah entered the room, her expression carefully neutral. Dr. Carter, Mr. Sims, this way, please. The two men followed her back to the reception area. As Elijah prepared to leave, Marvin's voice followed him. We'll see how far history gets you, Doc. The streets of Millwood buzzed with quiet activity as Elijah exited the courthouse. He paused for a moment, taking a steadying breath. The exchange with Marvin had been unpleasant, but not surprising. He'd grown accustomed to people like Marvin, those who dismissed his accomplishments, his heritage, and his resolve with thinly veiled condescension. Still, the encounter gnawed at him, a reminder of how exhausting these battles could be. As he made his way to his car, a patrol car slowed to a crawl beside him. The officer inside, a man with a square jaw and mirrored sunglasses, rolled down the window. Afternoon, the officer drawled, his tone casual but edged with something colder. Afternoon, Elijah replied evenly, stopping to face the car. You new around here? The officer asked, though it didn't sound like a question. Not exactly, Elijah said. I have family ties to the area. The officer's lips curved into a tight smile. That right? Well, you'll find we like things simple around here. Folks who know their place get along just fine. Elijah's chest tightened, but he kept his expression calm. I'll keep that in mind. The officer's gaze lingered a moment longer before he tipped his hat. You do that. Safe travels now. As the patrol car pulled away, Elijah exhaled slowly, his hand gripping the strap of his briefcase. The words weren't a threat, not explicitly. But he'd lived through enough to recognize the warning beneath them. Climbing into his car, Elijah stared at the steering wheel for a moment, his mind replaying the day's events. From Deborah's clipped tone, to Marvin's overt dismissal, to the officer's veiled warning, the message was clear. His presence, his purpose, was unwelcome. But Elijah had no intention of backing down. This land wasn't just soil and trees, it was a testament to his family's perseverance, a symbol of what they had endured and achieved. Giving it up wasn't an option. He started the engine and pulled onto the road, his resolve hardening with every mile. The sky had begun to darken by the time Elijah returned to the small rental house on the edge of town, his mind still churning with the day's events. He had barely set his briefcase down when his phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a message from Mitchell, an old family friend who had grown up in Millwood but left years ago. Mitchell. Heard about your meeting today. Be careful Sims doesn't play fair. Elijah sighed, typing a quick reply. Thanks for the heads up. Let me know if you hear anything. He placed the phone face down, trying to push away the unease that had been following him since the courthouse. Just as he was about to settle in with the documents he'd brought, a loud knock echoed through the house. Elijah frowned, his pulse quickening. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened the door, 2 police officers stood on the porch, their expressions cold and impassive. One of them, Officer Daniels, was the same man who had tailed him earlier. The other, a younger officer with a rigid stance, held a notepad in his hand. Dr. Carter? Daniels asked, though the tone suggested he already knew the answer. That's right, Elijah said, keeping his voice even. Is there a problem? We received a report about suspicious activity in the area, Daniels said, his eyes narrowing slightly. Mind if we ask you a few questions? Suspicious activity, Elijah felt his jaw tighten but forced himself to remain calm. Of course, what seems to be the issue? The younger officer's gaze flicked to Elijah's car parked in the driveway. We've been told there's been someone unfamiliar hanging around matches your description. Mind explaining what you're doing here? Elijah took a slow breath, keeping his tone measured. I'm here to address a legal matter concerning my family's property. I've been in contact with Judge Whitaker and other local authorities. If you need verification, I'm happy to provide it. Daniel's lips curved into a faint smirk. That's so. Because some folks are saying you've been snooping where you don't belong. The insinuation hit like a slap, but Elijah didn't flinch. I have every right to be here. If this is about my presence in town, perhaps you should direct your questions to Judge Whitaker or Mr. Sims, since they're aware of my business. Daniel stepped closer, his posture more confrontational. Now there's no need to get defensive, we're just doing our job, making sure everything's on the up and up. And I've just explained that it is, Elijah replied, his tone firm but composed. The younger officer glanced at Daniels, as if waiting for a cue. Daniels seemed to deliberate for a moment before taking another step forward. Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be, Doc. Mind if we take a look around? Just routine, you understand? Elijah's stomach tightened. I don't believe that's necessary. Unless you have a warrant, I'm going to have to decline. Daniels's smirk hardened into something colder. You got something to hide? Not at all, Elijah said, holding his ground. But I also know my rights. The tension crackled like static in the air. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, while Daniel's eyes burned with thinly veiled irritation. Finally, Daniel stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. All right, Doc, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. We'll be on our way, but don't be surprised if we're back folks around here like they're peace and quiet. Elijah closed the door behind them, his heart pounding. He leaned against the wall, taking a moment to gather himself. The message was clear. They wanted him gone, but he wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, Elijah arrived at the diner where he'd agreed to meet Mitchell. The place was small and unassuming, with a handful of patrons scattered across vinyl booths. Mitchell was already waiting at a corner table, his expression serious. You look like you've had a night, Mitchell said, as Elijah slid into the seat opposite him. Elijah gave a small nod. 2 officers showed up at my rental, claimed they got reports of suspicious activity. Mitchell let out a low whistle. Daniels, I bet he's been Sims's lapdog for years. They're trying to rattle you. It's more than that, Elijah said. This isn't just about me, it's about power. They think they can intimidate me into walking away. Mitchell leaned in, lowering his voice. They've pulled this kind of thing before. There's a reason a lot of folks with claims like yours don't stick around to fight, but you're not just anybody. They're scared of what you represent. Elijah's eyes narrowed. And what's that? Change, Mitchell said simply. Accountability. They're used to getting away with things because no one here has the resources or the clout to stand up to them. But you've got both, and they know it. The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with implication. Elijah took a sip of his coffee, the bitterness grounding him. So what do I do? He asked finally. Mitchell's expression hardened. You dig in, and you make sure they know you're not backing down. By the time Elijah returned to the courthouse for the next hearing, the tension in the air was palpable. The small courtroom was more crowded than before, whispers rippling through the room as Elijah took his seat. Marvin Sims sat across from him, his smirk firmly in place, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Judge Whitaker entered, his expression as neutral as ever, and called the session to order. As the proceedings began, Elijah noticed the subtle shifts in the room, the way Marvin's attorney avoided eye contact when Elijah's evidence was presented, the faint ripple of murmurs when Judge Whitaker asked pointed questions about Sims's development plans. But it was when Elijah took the stand to speak about the historical significance of the land that the atmosphere truly shifted. He spoke with quiet conviction, painting a vivid picture of the sacrifices his family had made, the resilience they had shown, and the importance of preserving their legacy. As he finished, a voice from the back of the room broke the silence. "Sounds like he's got a point." Heads turned as an older man stood, his weathered face etched with lines of hard-earned wisdom. "That land's been part of this town's history longer than most of us have been alive. Maybe it's time we started respecting that." The murmurs grew louder, a ripple of support spreading through the room. Marvin shifted uncomfortably, his smirk fading. For the first time, Elijah saw a crack in the facade. Judge Whitaker raised his gavel, calling for order, but the shift in momentum was undeniable. As Elijah stepped down from the stand, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like the tide was beginning to turn. And then, just as the session was about to adjourn, Daniels entered the courtroom, his expression grim. He walked straight to Marvin, whispering something that made the man's face darken. Elijah's pulse quickened. Whatever was happening, it was clear that the stakes were about to rise even higher. As the courtroom emptied, Elijah lingered by the wooden benches, watching Marvin and Daniels converse in hushed tones near the judge's chambers. Their body language spoke volumes. Marvin's clenched fists and Daniels' curt nods suggested urgency. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't good. Mitchell approached Elijah, his expression grim. "They're rattled," he said quietly. "Marvin's not used to pushback, and Daniels isn't the type to let things play out without stirring the pot." "I noticed," Elijah replied, his voice low. "Something tells me they're about to make their next move." Mitchell hesitated before speaking. "Elijah, they're not above using dirty tactics. You need to be ready for whatever comes next." Elijah nodded, his resolve hardening. "I've come too far to back down now." That evening, as Elijah worked through his notes, a sudden knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. Two uniformed officers stood outside, one of them holding a clipboard. It wasn't Daniels, but their presence still set his nerves on edge. Elijah opened the door, keeping his expression neutral. "Can I help you?" The taller officer, whose badge read Riley, cleared his throat. "Dr. Carter, we received a report about a disturbance near your property. We need you to come with us to answer some questions." "A disturbance?" Elijah's brow furrowed. "What kind of disturbance?" Riley shifted uncomfortably. There was a complaint about trespassing and possible vandalism. Witnesses claim they saw someone matching your description on the property. Elijah's heart pounded, but he kept his tone measured. "That's absurd. I haven't been near the property since the hearing." The second officer, shorter and younger, glanced at Riley, as if seeking confirmation. Riley's stance stiffened. "We're just following up, sir. If you could come down to the station, we can sort this out." Elijah's instincts screamed that this was a setup, but refusing could escalate the situation. "Fine," he said, grabbing his coat. "Let's get this over with." At the station, Elijah was led to a small, stark interview room. A single overhead light cast harsh shadows across the walls. After a few tense minutes, the door opened, and Officer Daniels walked in, a smug smile plastered across his face. "Evening, Doc," Daniels drawled, dropping a folder onto the table. "Didn't expect to see you here, but I guess trouble has a way of finding people." Elijah folded his arms, meeting Daniels's gaze evenly. "Cut to the chase. What's this really about?" Daniels's smile widened. "Straight to the point, I like that." He opened the folder, pulling out a series of grainy photos. These were taken near the Carter property earlier today. "Recognize anyone?" Elijah leaned forward, studying the images. They showed a figure in a dark coat, their face obscured, walking along the property line. "This proves nothing," Elijah said calmly. That could be anyone. Maybe, Daniel said, leaning back in his chair. But it's enough to raise questions, and questions lead to investigations, investigations that could take a long time to resolve. Elijah saw through the bluff. You're hoping to tie me up in red tape, waste my time, and drain my resources. Daniel shrugged, feigning innocence. I'm just doing my job, Doc. But hey, if you've got nothing to hide, this should all blow over soon enough. Am I being charged with anything? Elijah asked, his tone sharp. Daniel's smirk faltered. Not yet, but I wouldn't stray too far from town. We might have more questions. Elijah stood, his voice steady, but firm. If we're done here, I'll be leaving. Daniels leaned forward, his tone dropping. You think you're better than us, don't you? Coming in here with your fancy degrees and big ideas, but Millwood doesn't change, and neither do its people. Elijah stared at him, unflinching. Then it's time someone changed it. The next day, Elijah met with Mitchell at the diner again, filling him in on the night's events. Mitchell's jaw tightened as he listened. They're trying to wear you down, Mitchell said. But we've got something they don't. And what's that? Elijah asked. The truth, Mitchell replied. I've been digging into Sims's development plans. Turns out, there's more to this than just your land. He's been strong-arming other property owners, pressuring them to sell. Some of them have stories that sound a lot like yours. Elijah leaned forward, his interest piqued. If we can prove a pattern, it could strengthen my case. Exactly, Mitchell said, and I think I know someone who can help. That evening, Elijah and Mitchell drove to the outskirts of town, where they met Angela Fisher, a former council member turned whistleblower. Angela had been ousted from her position after challenging Sims on a similar development project years ago. Marvin Sims has been pulling strings in this town for decades, Angela said, her voice resolute. He's got friends in high places, but he's made a lot of enemies too. People are afraid to speak out, but if enough of us come forward, we can take him down. Elijah felt a spark of hope. Will you testify? Angela hesitated, then nodded. I'll do what needs to be done, but you need to be ready for a fight. Sims won't go down without a war. As they drove back to town, Elijah's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, but the stakes were higher than ever. Sims and Daniels would push back harder, and the town's deep-seated biases would make the fight even more difficult. But Elijah wasn't alone anymore. With allies like Mitchell and Angela, he had a chance to expose the corruption that had plagued Millwood for too long. As they passed the Carter property, Elijah noticed a pair of headlights parked along the edge of the lot. He slowed the car, his chest tightening as he recognized the vehicle. It was Daniels's patrol car, and inside, two silhouettes sat watching the property. Mitchell noticed it too. They're not even trying to be subtle anymore. Elijah's grip on the wheel tightened. Let them watch. We'll give them something to see soon enough. The courthouse was packed, an unusual sight for a small town like Millwood. Word had spread quickly about the hearing, and the air buzzed with tension as locals, reporters, and even distant spectators crammed into the narrow wooden pews. At the center of it all sat Elijah Carter, calm but resolute, his gaze fixed on Marvin Sims and Officer Daniels, who stood together near the defense table. Their whispered conversation and furtive glances toward Elijah betrayed a simmering anxiety, though both worked hard to mask it. Judge Whitaker entered the room, her gavel striking sharply against the block. This court is now in session, she declared, scanning the room with her piercing gaze. Today, we will address the matter of Dr. Elijah Carter's claims against Mr. Marvin Sims and the surrounding allegations of misconduct. Dr. Carter, you may proceed with your statement. Elijah rose, his heart pounding, but his voice steady. Thank you, Your Honor. He turned to the packed courtroom, his measured tone carrying across the space. This case isn't just about land. It's about power, corruption, and the lengths some will go to maintain their grip on both. The Carter property has been in my family for generations, a testament to our perseverance and a symbol of what we've overcome. But it's more than that. It's a piece of history, not just mine, but this community's, and that history is under attack. Marvin smirked, leaning back in his chair, but the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead betrayed his discomfort. Elijah ignored him, continuing, Since I've returned to Millwood, I've faced relentless intimidation, and baseless accusations designed to discredit me. But these tactics aren't new. They're part of a broader pattern of behavior, one that Mr. Sims has employed to silence others who dared to stand in his way. Elijah stepped toward the judge, holding up a folder. Your Honor, I've submitted evidence outlining Mr. Sims's history of coercion and strong-arming property owners in this town. This includes signed statements from individuals who were pressured into selling their land under dubious circumstances, as well as financial records showing questionable transactions. Judge Whitaker gestured for him to place the folder on the bench. Proceed. Elijah placed it down and turned back to the room. But it doesn't end there. Officer Daniels has played a pivotal role in these schemes, using his authority to harass and intimidate those who resist. Last night, I was falsely accused of trespassing on my own property, a charge brought forth with no credible evidence. Daniels shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor, he barked, his face reddening. These are baseless accusations. Judge Whitaker's sharp gaze cut through the room. Sit down, Officer Daniels. You will have your turn to speak. Daniels hesitated, his jaw tightening, before sinking back into his seat. Elijah seized the moment. This is more than a personal vendetta. It's a coordinated effort to strip this community of its heritage and to silence those who stand in the way of greed and corruption, but I will not be silenced. The room erupted in murmurs, the weight of Elijah's words rippling through the crowd. Judge Whitaker banged her gavel. Order in the court! When it was Marvin's turn to speak, he rose slowly, his smirk replaced by a thin veneer of professionalism. Your Honor, with all due respect, Dr. Carter is painting a picture of conspiracy where none exists. My only goal has been to improve this community through responsible development. The Carter property, while historically significant, has sat unused for years. My plans would bring jobs and economic growth to Millwood. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. As for these accusations of coercion, they're just that. Accusations, no concrete proof has been provided. Marvin's voice dripped with confidence, but Elijah noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he gestured to the crowd. It was subtle, but it spoke volumes. Then the surprise witness entered. Angela Fisher, the former councilwoman, stepped into the courtroom. Gasps rippled through the audience as she made her way to the stand. Marvin's face paled, and Daniel's smirk vanished entirely. Ms. Fisher, Judge Whitaker said, you've been called to provide testimony. Please state your name and your connection to this case. Angela nodded. My name is Angela Fisher. I'm a former council member for the town of Millwood. I'm here to expose the truth about Mr. Sims and Officer Daniels. Her testimony was damning. She detailed Marvin's backroom deals, the pressure campaigns, and the fear tactics used to force property owners to sell. She described Daniels's role in enforcing these schemes, painting a chilling picture of systemic corruption. As Angela spoke, Elijah watched Marvin's composure crumble. He shifted uncomfortably, his hands clenching and unclenching on the table. Daniels, meanwhile, glared daggers at Angela, his face a mask of barely contained rage. When she finished, Judge Whitaker leaned forward. Ms. Fisher, do you have evidence to support these claims? Angela reached into her bag and produced a stack of documents. Yes, Your Honor. These are emails, meeting notes, and financial records that corroborate everything I've said. The judge accepted the documents, her expression unreadable. Thank you, Ms. Fisher. You may step down. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Judge Whitaker reviewed the evidence. Finally, she looked up, her expression stern. It is clear to this court that there is substantial evidence of misconduct on the part of Mr. Sims and Officer Daniels, based on the testimony and documents provided. I am ordering an immediate investigation into their actions. Additionally, the Carter property will remain under the rightful ownership of Dr. Elijah Carter until this matter is resolved. The room erupted into cheers and applause. Elijah exhaled deeply, the weight of the battle finally lifting. But it wasn't over yet. As the gavel struck, Daniels stood abruptly, his face twisted in anger. This isn't justice, he spat, his voice rising. This is a farce. Judge Whitaker's gavel slammed again. Officer Daniels, control yourself, or I will hold you in contempt of court. Daniels glared at Elijah one last time before storming out of the courtroom, his fury palpable. Marvin followed suit, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Outside the courthouse, Elijah was met with a flood of supporters. Mitchell clapped him on the back, his grin wide. "You did it, Elijah. You stood your ground, and you won." Elijah smiled, though his eyes remained focused on the horizon. "This is just the beginning," he said. "There's still work to be done." As the crowd began to disperse, Elijah caught sight of Angela standing quietly by the steps. He approached her, gratitude etched on his face. "Thank you," he said. "Your courage made all the difference." Angela nodded, her expression resolute. "It's time this town faced its demons, and it's time we fought for something better." Elijah looked out at the town square, the weight of the moment settling over him. The fight for justice wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like they were on the right path, and he wasn't fighting alone. The air in the Millwood town square was electric. A makeshift podium stood in front of the courthouse steps, surrounded by a growing crowd of townspeople. News of the day's revelations had spread like wildfire, drawing supporters and skeptics alike. Elijah Carter stood behind the podium, his hands resting firmly on its edges, scanning the sea of faces. Among them, he spotted Mitchell and Angela, their expressions resolute, standing as a quiet but powerful reminder of why he was here. Near the edge of the crowd, Marvin Sims and Officer Daniels lingered, their presence a dark cloud threatening to overshadow the moment Daniels leaned against his patrol car, arms crossed, his mouth set in a sneer. Sims stood a few paces away, his usual bravado replaced with a look of cold calculation. Elijah knew this was the moment they had been waiting for. Their last chance to discredit him, to assert their dominance. Elijah took a deep breath and adjusted the microphone. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "Today we've taken the first step toward justice. For too long, this town has been mired in corruption and fear. For too long, those in power have abused their positions, preying on the vulnerable and silencing those who dare to speak out." The crowd murmured in agreement, a ripple of support that bolstered Elijah's resolve. He glanced toward Marvin and Daniels, making no effort to hide his focus. "We've seen the evidence," Elijah continued. "Emails, financial records, and testimonies that reveal a pattern of coercion and corruption. This is not speculation, it's fact, and it's time we held those responsible accountable." Daniels pushed off the car and strode toward the podium, his presence alone slicing through the atmosphere like a knife. The crowd parted reluctantly as he approached, his boots crunching against the gravel. When he reached the base of the steps, he stopped and called out, his voice loud and mocking. "Big words for a man who doesn't belong here," Daniels said, his smirk widening. "You think you can waltz into Millwood and play the hero? This town doesn't need saving. It's fine just the way it is." Elijah met his gaze, unflinching. "Fine for you? Maybe. For the rest of us, it's a different story." The crowd murmured again, this time louder, emboldened by Elijah's defiance. Daniels's smirk faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered. "You don't get it, do you?" Daniels sneered. "You're an outsider. You don't understand how things work here. You never will." Elijah stepped out from behind the podium and descended the steps, closing the distance between himself and Daniels. The crowd's whispers hushed, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "You're right about one thing," Elijah said, his voice low but firm. "I don't understand how someone sworn to protect this community could betray it so completely. You've used your badge as a weapon, not a shield. You've silenced voices instead of amplifying them. And for what? To protect men like Marvin Sims, to line your pockets while the people you're supposed to serve suffer?" Daniel's face darkened, the sneer giving way to something colder and more dangerous. "Watch your mouth, Carter. You don't know who you're messing with." "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Elijah shot back. "And so does everyone else here." He turned to the crowd, raising his voice. "This is the man who threatened me on my own property, the man who fabricated charges to intimidate me, the man who has enabled corruption in this town for years, and he's not alone." Elijah pointed toward Marvin, who stiffened under the weight of the crowd's collective gaze. "Marvin Sims has built his empire on the backs of hardworking people, using fear and manipulation to take what doesn't belong to him. Together, they've turned Millwood into a place where justice is a commodity, sold to the highest bidder, but not anymore." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their support washing over Elijah like a wave. Daniels's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. Marvin looked as if he wanted to disappear. "Enough of this!" Daniels roared, stepping closer to Elijah. "You think you can come here and tear us down with your righteous speeches? You're nothing but a troublemaker, Carter. And troublemakers don't last long in Millwood." Elijah stood his ground, his voice calm but unwavering. "That's where you're wrong. The people of this town deserve better, and they're not afraid of you anymore. You've already lost, Daniels. You just don't know it yet." As if on cue, Angela stepped forward from the crowd, holding a small recording device aloft. "This," she said, her voice carrying across the square, "is a recording of Daniels and Sims discussing their plans to force Dr. Carter off his land. It's all here. The threats, the bribes, the lies. And it's going straight to the state attorney's office." The crowd's cheers reached a fever pitch as Daniels's face drained of color. He turned to Marvin, who looked equally panicked, his lips moving soundlessly as if searching for an excuse. Elijah stepped closer, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Your time is up," he said, his words directed at both men. "You can't hide from the truth anymore. The people of Millwood deserve justice, and they're going to get it." Daniels backed away, his confidence shattered, while Marvin all but stumbled as he retreated into the crowd. Elijah returned to the podium, his chest heaving with adrenaline. "This isn't the end," he said, addressing the crowd once more. "It's the beginning of something better. Together, we can rebuild this town together. We can make Millwood a place where everyone has a voice, where justice is more than just a word." The cheers were deafening, a roar of solidarity and hope that echoed through the square. But as Elijah looked out over the crowd, he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. Daniels and Sims had been exposed, but their influence ran deep. The battle for Millwood's future had only just begun. The morning after the confrontation, sunlight streamed through the windows of the courthouse as Elijah Carter sat at a polished wooden table, surrounded by his allies. Angela Fisher, now something of a local hero for her bravery, sifted through a stack of documents while Mitchell updated him on the town's latest reactions. "They've opened an official investigation into Sims and Daniels," Mitchell said, his voice tinged with satisfaction. "The state attorney's office wants to review Angela's recording, and the evidence we presented. Looks like the wheels are finally turning." Elijah nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. It was a victory, albeit a tentative one. "What about Daniels? Has he been removed from duty?" Angela leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Suspended, pending the investigation. But don't think for a second he's out of the game yet. Men like him don't go down without a fight." Elijah's smile faded. He knew she was right. Daniels and Sims might be temporarily sidelined, but their influence still lingered like a shadow over Millwood. Still, the steps taken over the past few days marked a significant shift. A crack in the foundation of the old, corrupt system. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, smaller than the one from the night before, but no less supportive. As Elijah stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the applause started, a ripple that grew into a wave of cheers and whistles. He raised a hand in acknowledgement, pausing to take in the faces of the townspeople who had come to witness this moment. "Dr. Carter," a voice called from the front of the crowd. It was a young woman holding a notepad and pen. She stepped forward, her expression eager. "I'm with the Millwood Gazette. Can I get a comment on what's next for you?" Elijah smiled, the warmth of the community's support bolstering his resolve. "What's next is ensuring that this investigation leads to real accountability," he said. "But more importantly, it's about continuing to fight for fairness and justice, not just for me, but for everyone in this town." The reporter nodded, jotting down his words. Behind her, more faces in the crowd lit up with hope, their cheers renewing as Elijah stepped down to join them. He shook hands, exchanged words of encouragement, and felt the profound weight of what this fight had meant to so many. Meanwhile, Marvin Sims sat in his office at the edge of town, the room's usually pristine order disrupted by scattered papers and overturned chairs. His face was a mask of fury as he listened to the voicemail from his attorney. "The state's investigation is moving forward," the voice droned. "It's only a matter of time before they file formal charges. I recommend we prepare for—" Sims slammed the phone down, cutting off the message. His carefully constructed empire was crumbling around him, and for the first time, he felt powerless to stop it. He turned to the window, glaring out at the town he'd once controlled with an iron grip. The people had turned against him, emboldened by Carter and Fisher's defiance. And Daniels, his supposed enforcer, was now a liability, his corruption too exposed to be useful anymore. For the first time in his career, Marvin Sims felt the bitter sting of defeat. A week later, Elijah stood on the Carter property, the cool autumn breeze rustling the trees. The land was quiet now, but it no longer felt like a battleground. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something new. Angela joined him, her expression thoughtful as she surveyed the property. "You've got a lot of people behind you now," she said. "What are you going to do with that?" Elijah considered her words, his gaze sweeping over the land. "This place has always been a symbol of resilience," he said. "I want to build on that, maybe a community center or a museum, something that honors our history while giving back to the people." Angela nodded, a small smile breaking through her usual seriousness. "I think that's exactly what this town needs." The systemic changes Elijah had hoped for were already beginning to take shape. The investigation into Sims and Daniels uncovered a web of corruption that went deeper than anyone had expected, implicating several other officials and leading to sweeping reforms in local governance policies were introduced to ensure greater transparency and accountability. And for the first time in decades, the people of Millwood felt like they had a say in how their town was run. But the fight wasn't over. Elijah knew that lasting change would require vigilance and effort. There were still challenges to face, still prejudices and power imbalances to confront. But for the first time, he felt like the tide was turning. Months later, the Carter property was transformed. The once overgrown land now featured a modest but beautifully designed community center, its walls adorned with photographs and artifacts that told the story of Millwood's rich and complicated history. The opening ceremony drew a crowd even larger than the one at the courthouse, a testament to how far the town had come. Elijah stood at the center of it all, a quiet pride filling him as he watched children play in the newly built park and families explore the exhibits inside the center. Mitchell stood nearby, grinning as he handed out flyers for upcoming community events, while Angela spoke with a reporter about the significance of the day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the land in a warm golden light, Elijah felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. The fight for justice was ongoing, but today, at least, was a victory worth savoring. The day of the community center's opening ended with a quiet sense of triumph. As the crowd trickled away and the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah Carter found himself standing alone on the Carter property, the air cool and still. He gazed at the newly constructed building, its clean lines and bright windows glowing warmly against the twilight sky, and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was the culmination of everything he and his family had fought for, not just over the past few months, but over generations. Elijah thought back to his grandfather, a man who had tilled this land with his bare hands, carving out a legacy despite the odds stacked against him. This property had been a sanctuary, a symbol of resilience, and now it was a beacon for the community. Standing there, Elijah felt a surge of gratitude for those who had come before him and a renewed sense of responsibility for those who would come after. Personal growth and reflection. The battle for the Carter property had changed Elijah profoundly. It had tested his resolve, challenged his patience, and forced him to confront injustices he had long known but never experienced so viscerally. Despite his success as a surgeon, Elijah had always been cautious about using his voice outside the operating room, but this fight had awakened something in him, a determination to stand against inequity, not just for his family, but for everyone. "Justice isn't handed to you," he had said during one of the hearings. "You have to fight for it, and when you win, you fight to keep it." Those words rang truer now than ever. Elijah had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. He had faced down powerful figures like Marvin Sims and Officer Daniels, men who had wielded their authority as weapons, and he had come out stronger. The experience had left scars, both literal and emotional, but it had also forged a deeper understanding of himself and his purpose. Broader implications. Elijah's fight was not an isolated one. It had pulled back the curtain on systemic issues that had plagued Millwood for decades. Unchecked power, corruption, and deeply ingrained prejudice. The investigation into Sims and Daniels uncovered not only their personal wrongdoing, but a network of policies and practices designed to marginalize vulnerable communities. The revelations shocked the town, but they also sparked a wave of activism. Angela Fisher became a leading voice in the movement for transparency and accountability in Millwood's local government. Her courage in testifying against Sims inspired others to come forward with their own stories. Mitchell, ever the pragmatist, worked tirelessly to organize town meetings, ensuring that residents had a platform to voice their concerns and shape the future of their community. The changes were slow and often met with resistance, but they were real. Sims and Daniels faced criminal charges. Their influence over the town effectively dismantled. New leaders emerged, driven by a commitment to fairness and equality. For the first time in years, Millwood's residents felt a glimmer of hope that things could be different. Elijah's victory was a reminder that systemic change starts with individuals willing to stand up and say, "Enough." It was a testament to the power of collective action, of what could be achieved when people refuse to accept the status quo. Inspiration for the future. As Elijah stood on the property that evening, he thought about the road ahead. The Carter Community Center was just the beginning. It would serve as a space for education, dialogue, and healing, a place where the town's history could be honored while its future was built. Elijah planned to collaborate with local leaders to create programs that addressed Millwood's most pressing issues, from economic inequality to racial injustice. He also knew that his fight for justice wouldn't end with Millwood. The experience had ignited a fire in him, a desire to take his advocacy beyond the town's borders. He began to envision a broader mission, using his voice and resources to support other communities facing similar struggles. The battle for the Carter property had shown him that change was possible, but it required persistence, solidarity, and an unrelenting belief in the power of truth. "This isn't the end," Elijah told himself. "It's the beginning of something bigger." A call to action. The story of the Carter property resonated far beyond Millwood, inspiring people from all walks of life to examine their own communities. It became a rallying cry for those who had been dismissed or marginalized, a reminder that their voices mattered. Elijah received letters from across the country, words of gratitude, solidarity, and hope. One letter, written by a young activist, stood out to him. "Your fight gave me the courage to start my own. Thank you for showing us that even when the odds feel impossible, we're never alone." Elijah folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, knowing it would serve as a reminder on the hard days. Change wasn't easy, but it was worth every ounce of effort. Emotional closure. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Elijah turned back toward the community center, where the warm light from its windows spilled onto the ground. He could hear the faint sound of laughter and conversation from inside, the voices of a community coming together. He felt a sense of peace, knowing that his grandfather's legacy had not only been preserved, but transformed into something even greater. The land that once represented survival and resilience now stood as a symbol of unity and progress. Walking toward the building, Elijah allowed himself a rare moment of quiet pride. The fight had been long and grueling, but it had been worth it. And as he stepped inside, greeted by the smiles of those who had stood beside him, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning.